David Hockney has never been more prolific. His work is constantly evolving, capturing altered perspectives, multiple vanishing points and different moments in time which keep the viewer engrossed and on his toes. In 1988, Hockney offered the Southbank show a guided tour of the largest exhibition of his work at the Tate Gallery in London.
I like the fact, for all sorts of reasons, that the first picture we come to in this massive exhibition is of your father, which you painted when you were 17 or 18, 1955. Can you remember which, 17?
17. Well, it was painted in January because I think it's about the first oil painting I ever did. And it's done on an old canvas my father had given me. He bought it at a jumble sale, the canvas. So I just painted on the top of it. And he said he'd pose, so I painted a portrait of him. And I sent it to an exhibition. It was about the first picture I ever exhibited as well. It was a Yorkshire Artists Exhibition in Leeds. I didn't even put any price on it, actually. And somebody wanted to buy it. But it's painted in the kind of way they're beginning to teach you to paint at the art school.
One of the nice things about it is what's behind it. The fact that he got you a canvas, he agreed to pose, suggests a degree of encouragement and interest in what you were doing, which is must have been very helpful.
He also set up a kind of mirror system so he could watch. You see, after all, if you're painting somebody, they don't watch. But he set up a mirror system. And I think he did keep complaining that the colours were muddy. Well, they are, but I said, well, that's what you have to do at the art school. That's what you have to paint that way.
I know it was bought by this man, and eventually, many years later, 20-odd years later, 30-odd years later, you bought it back. What do you think of it now as a painting?
Well, it's just a little dull art school picture, actually, but because I did it and it's of my father, it's of great sentimental attachment to me.
He talks about his paintings in a way that doesn't sell them, and doesn't even explain them, really. He isn't seeking to explain them. He's seeking just to enjoy them and saying, this is what, and then he takes off in little arias about them. It's a complete delight to talk to. It's partly in his character. I mean, he's Bradford Grammar School, he was properly brought up. It's partly, I think, to do with this enormous self-confidence that he built up from an early age, very early age. And he was famous from the time he was a student. In his second year, I think it was, when he was at the Royal College, he was selling paintings.
Let's move on to We Two Boys Together Clinging. This is 1961, and your paintings you began doing as a student at the Royal College of Art.
I did a few paintings, in a sense, based on, like, abstract expressionist ideas, but it wasn't that satisfying to me. So slowly, I started putting lettering in pictures.
Yeah.
That seemed to me to make the... after all, it's from a cubist idea, lettering in pictures, isn't it? So I started putting it in and realised that the moment you put a word there, it was a little bit like a figure. You were forced to look at it. You were forced to read it. You could not but help do that. The words are from a poem of Walt Whitman, and one of his poems was We Two Boys Together Clinging, which I thought was could be interpreted all kinds of ways. It was even sexy. So I made a painting of it and put it in.
Did you feel you were rather bold making a painting at that time in '61 called We Two Boys Together Clinging?
A little cheeky, perhaps.
Is the sense in this is one of the first paintings which is telling people about yourself as a painter, as a person?
Yeah, I think when saying, you know, you become aware, say, of homosexuality, so you start dealing with that and telling people, in a sense, to piss off about it. I'm this way, and you do it like that. I mean, that's what you're doing. And in that sense, I suppose it was bold, but I didn't really think so. After all, art students are not really... they don't care too much about what kind of sex you have or what...
What's very interesting about Hockney's very early work is, you know, you can talk about it in terms of pop art, although as his dealer, Paul Casman, once said he was a pop artist for about 5 minutes. American abstract expressionism, French art brut. You can name check all of those things, but there's something fundamentally original. There's a real verve, vibrancy, energy, and confessional edge. You know, those early works, we two boys together clinging, you know, are about a kind of hidden sexuality at a time when homosexuality is still criminal. And Hockney sort of explores in a coded way, but also obviously proclaims, you know, this is who I am. And in a sense, there's never been that kind of sense of openness in British art.
After you moved to California in 1964, you became the painter of Southern California. The Piranesi of Los Angeles was a phrase that was floated around. What drew you to Los Angeles, and what drew you to doing all these paintings about water and pools there?
Well, sun, I think, drew me to Los Angeles because it's nice and warm and it's always sunny, which means it's always sexy, which means it's light, full of colour. And I just had a hunch that it was a place I'd like. I just went there, I didn't know a soul there. I thought it was 3 times better than I'd imagined when I got there.
What drew you to painting pools? And then tell us a bit more specifically about
Well, I noticed the patterns that the water makes. Some people never notice the patterns at all. But I noticed them, and you see this kind of dancing light, there's light causing it. And frankly, I was also aware that it only happens on the surface of the water, this thinnest film. How thick is it? Does it actually exist? It's only on the surface. What he was about, each one of them, I was painting the water in different ways. I mean, if you photograph moving water in a swimming pool, it will always, it's frozen. You become deeply aware it's frozen. Whereas if you're painting, you make the lines dance and flow and so on. You have time.
What were you doing with this splash, most specifically?
Well, this was painted after a lot of these. This is 3 or 4 years after.
Yes.
It's called a bigger splash simply because there's a little splash, there's a splash, and this is bigger, so it was called a bigger splash. It's only referring to the size of the painting, not the size of the splash. But actually, it was painted, the splash itself is actually painted from a photograph of the splash. You can't quite see a splash, really, yourself. They last such a short time. It amused me, the fact that it took me actually about 2 weeks to paint this thing that was a very fragile moment.
You've painted a lot of double portraits, and there are quite a few of them in this particular gallery. What attracts you about the double portrait, first of all?
A double portrait is obviously about a relationship as well. I mean, in a sense, they're not quite like a portrait. I mean, it's more important about what's going on between 2 people.
Well, what's going on here, would you say?
Well, this was a portrait of 2 friends of mine. Ozzy was a fashion designer. Celia designed fabrics. And their relationship did rather fascinate me, actually. In a way, you begin with the wrong thing. I mean, she should be sitting down, really, shouldn't she? And it should be Ozzy standing up, actually. But Ozzy wasn't quite the normal husband who would stand up. He wanted to sit down. I think it might have been Celia's vanity. She probably thought she looked better stood up in this dress. I wanted them, the 2 figures, in a very clear space, like a Piero della Francesca figures in a clear space, or Fra Angelica's figures in a clear space. I like painting like that. I liked Italian painting like that.
There's often a duality in his art. What's there on the surface, what lies underneath. And I think that he's exploring, sometimes explicitly, the tensions in given relationships. Sometimes it's just the tension in how 2 figures are in a given space. But I think also he's reworking what's called the conversation piece, which is an 18th century idea in portraiture, where there is a sense of interaction between figures. And Mr. and Mrs. Clark and Percy, it's a brilliant example of how you take the most difficult option. The most difficult option being, He has the figures against the light. The open door and the light is right at the centre of the painting. It's much easier to have it on the left or the right, but he goes for the most difficult option. And it's that, I think, partly that gives the painting that extraordinary sense of originality.
Let's have a look at another double portrait over here, which is about 5 or 6 years later, and it's your parents. You've painted your parents a lot individually, particularly your mother.
My mother poses very patiently, as you can see sitting there. My father, the moment he thinks you're not painting with the brush, then he's no need to do, and he'll pick up a book or he'll do something else. He's not, if he thinks if you're not actually painting with the thing in your hand, he's no need to sit still. And in the end, his fidgetiness, I realised, was something I should put in the portrait. I had to put it in, and eventually I painted him looking at a book like that. But when my sister saw it, she thought it was a very accurate portrait. And that pleased me. I thought, that's better than what any art critic might say, because she sensed what it was about. After all, her parents as well. I moved to Paris, and I didn't do many paintings, very, very few, maybe 3 or 4 in 2 years. 1974, I was asked to design the Rake's Progress, Stravinsky's opera for Glyndebourne. And I went back to Hogarth as a source for the ideas and scoured the books on him. And one of the engravings I found was in a book about perspective. And this painting is based on the engraving. And I was amused by it because obviously what Hogarth was saying was, if you don't know about perspective, great big blunders will be made like this. And it's full of all the perspective being wrong. I mean, other in the sense that she could light his pipe from here, which, you know, spatially you're not supposed to be. She's on a different level. The little sheep get bigger as they go away. The lines are going out that way instead of doing that, and so on. And I was taken with the picture anyway, and I realised, frankly, Hogarth might have thought there were blunders, but it does work pictorially anyway. And I liked that. I mean, I liked the fact you can break the rules.
This is called A Visit with Christopher and Don. That's Christopher Isherwood and Don Biccardi, two very good friends of yours. You painted a double portrait of them as well. It's 1984.
It's kind of a crude first attempt to make another kind of narrative picture that you're forced to look around. In a sense, it begins right up on that yellow road up there, in a way, and then it moves round and round. But if you begin up on the yellow road, which is their road, Adelaide Drive...
The one that sweeps right across to the middle of the
right down,
painting,
and I always remember where to stop, because there's a big palm tree there with a sign that says 145 Adelaide Drive. And they park their little cars there. You can see the cars are parked there. Then you descend into their house. But when you're stood there, you look down into Santa Monica Canyon. Their house is actually on the side of the canyon. And you look down and you see a house on a cliff over there. Then, as you come down into their living room, which is here, these are actually the 2 chairs that were in the other painting.
Portrait, yeah.
You've come down into the living room and you look out of the window, and actually you see that house again. That's the same house. It's the same thing. You've moved. It means you've moved now down here, and here is the house, and it's that again. Then,
and it's 7 times in the painting, that
if
house.
you then walk along, which means you're not out here looking into the house, you're in it. As you walk along, here's the dining table, and again you see that house. You're moving along. You're then moving along a corridor past the bedroom with a big window, which you see the house again, because it's a long way away. The television set is in reverse perspective, which means you can move past it. I can see it from this side, or I can walk past it and see it from that side, which means it's about you moving. You come into Christopher's study and again see the house, you see, which means you're here looking at that house. And if you move all the way back, you come back. Don's studio was at the other end of the house, separate, and he has 2 floors there, and again you see the house So it means you're on this floor or that floor. And he would draw in it. And Christopher was a writer, Don was a painter, drawer. So I put them at, and in a sense, they worked at either side of the house.
He has this, I won't say fear, but he thinks there's a tyranny in realism. And the phrase realism is problematic. The double portraits, Mr. and Mrs. Clark and Percy in particular, he says is as close as he gets to naturalism in his art. But he's moved to and from conventional naturalism. And of course, conventional naturalism, for most people, is the idea of an image that seems, in inverted commas, photographic. Now, Hockney's really astute about this, and he's one of those rare artists that makes you look at the world again afresh when you've seen his work and when you've thought about what it is that he does. He said beautifully once, the photograph gets it nearly right, but in the tiny bit it gets wrong, or doesn't get right, it misses by a mile. And that's the area that I'm groping around in. And so much of the work of the last 20 years in different ways, particularly when he uses photography in a fragmented or collage way, deals with the tyranny of single-point perspective. We don't see the world from one perspective. We think we do, but actually our eyes move and we refocus and we see things from different... We see, I mean, even if we're static, we're looking at different perspectives all the time. And he wants to try and conflate that. I mean, that's part of the language of Cubism, and he's acknowledged that. That's what Picasso and Braque were doing in their fragmented Cubist forms. But he wants to explore that. So it's about ways of seeing, ways of looking, and a shattering, again, of single-point perspective.
At first, it looks like, frankly, quite a conventional picture with the road disappearing into the distance. It looks like a vanishing point there, but there's actually many, many vanishing points in it, because you are drawn into the space. I think it's a different feeling. I'll point out, it was very complicated to make. I mean, we needed a ladder for a start. If you think about it, this photograph alone, it's just the photograph of a stop sign. But you can't be on the road doing it because you'd be doing that, and it would therefore look like that. So I had a ladder, and I go up on the ladder and just photograph it. The lettering on the road is from a ladder looking very down. The viewpoint is not from here looking that. You're actually moving in this all over the place. I'm not out here, as it were, you see.
So what do these different points of view give? Well,
it makes a different space. That's what it's doing. It makes a space that pulls you in and you participate in, which seemed to me a more thrilling space. People were always telling me not to waste my time and so on. I took no notice. I thought, well, it's for me, actually, I'm doing it, not you, anyway. And when I finished it, I felt, as far as I was concerned, I had altered, in a sense, the idea of a landscape photograph. My photography friends in LA said it wasn't a photograph, it was a painting. I said, well, it's just made with a camera and it's made with all the photographic processing. On the other hand, the sky was made many times and I kept changing the color. So in a sense, it was getting near painting. After that, I went back to painting totally.
One of the many striking things about David Hockney is that he talks so well. There's almost no need to say anything at all about David, because he said it all about himself several times in different permutations, and very fluently and very well. He's always onto something new and wants to explain it to you. In fact, he wants to convert you to it. And when he's doing something new, like putting the photographs together or whatever next thing has taken his, not so much his fancy, but his interest, then he talks about nothing else.
The exhibition starts with a portrait of your father, which you did when you were 17, and ends with a portrait of your mother, which you did very recently indeed. That's sentimental, but is there anything else to it?
I didn't plan that first part of the exhibition. This is, we did put it here. This was painted just a few months ago. I painted in June, actually, in Bridlington. I went to stay with my sister, and I painted it there. And
you found your mother a very fertile subject throughout the years, haven't you? You've painted and drawn her and so on a great many times.
Well, I mean, when you're drawing, I've always said I wasn't that interested in drawing people I didn't know that well, because I didn't really know what they looked like. I mean, drawing your mother, or same as photographing your mother, you know a great deal about the face. You know, I painted that face in and out 12 times. The last time I did it was painted, possibly the face was probably painted in 3 or 4 minutes. But I'd had to struggle. I did about 12 before I did that. But each time I took it out is because I felt it wasn't my mother. Somebody else might have thought it looked like her, but I didn't.
Is there anything painterly that you can point to that says this is my mother, or is it a feeling you have about it? When you're saying you did it again and again, was that because she didn't look the way you, in your mind, knew her to feel, or the way you couldn't make her be on the canvas?
Well, it's a bit of both, but I mean, I wanted, as it were, an image of my mother there that I wanted to make as well as I could, and it was quite a struggle. But everything's a struggle, actually. I never do it easily.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
I like that. What did your mother think of the hands?
She hates me painting her hands, but because she's a lot of arthritis.
I noticed because my grandfather
all
had that
hands are expressive, aren't they? Yeah.